All right. So thanks again, I mean, for this opportunity. I think I've been meaning to come over to LA to do this for a while. Unfortunately, we're doing this virtually this time. So maybe in a future year, I'll actually get to do this in LA, and all of you will meet in one place. But this is an interesting event. I think it allows us to have a broader reach, as Vivek pointed out. So my name is Deepak Ganesan. I'm a professor of computer science at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And so my, I'm going to give the I'm going to touch upon similar themes, not entirely the same themes, but similar themes is what Vivek mentioned, but perhaps touch upon them from an engineering perspective, right? Look at it from the other side. And Vivek, maybe you can, you can give me an idea when I'm going too long, just so that, stop me 5 minutes before I have to stop.
Sure, go ahead.
All right, so let's talk about how the deployment of this works, and the engineers, look at this. How do you deploy a wearable sensing system in the context of a clinical problem? And so I'm going to drive this with an example, and it's a different example from the one that Vivek picked up, but it's one that I think is very, very current, and I think it'll give you a good perspective on the types of challenges and the thought process that goes into tackling some of these problems. So let's take, early on, when, during the early stages of the coronavirus, we were seeing clinicians were seeing these trends, and these people with normally low oxygen levels, and certainly there was a thought that maybe this was detectable early on, and since then a lot of different studies have gone off and done this. But let's say that's the problem that the clinician comes up with, right? They want to detect early symptoms of the coronavirus using a wearable sensor. And so let's think through how a clinician engineer team sort of goes about trying to tackle this problem. All right, so just, as I mentioned, there's a number of studies that have come out over the last year or so on this particular and this exact same type of problem, and they've led to some fascinating and intriguing results. For example, Mount Sinai's Warrior Watch study found that there were subtle changes in heart rate variability measured by an Apple Watch that signaled onset several days in advance of the nasal swab. And then a Scripps study found that it's possible to predict who has COVID-19 based on sort of the daily habits like sleep, activity, resting heart rate. So fascinating information. But so let's back up and ask the question again of how do you approach this, right? So the first stage of this is asking usually what sensors you want to use, right? And that requires domain knowledge, right? Oftentimes, the engineer would just say, let's just throw a whole bunch of sensors at the problem, but a team that's comprising engineers and the clinician has a more systematic way of approaching, right? So you have sort of the inside information about what metrics might be relevant. What do these initial patients that have come in with a virus, what symptoms are they exhibiting? And so all of that, you build up that domain knowledge. What are the change in physiological metrics? What are the changes in lifestyles that they're presenting with? And so you try to distill that into sort of what types of sensors might I want to use in order to obtain this kind of information, right? And so in this case, I've represented this as a matrix. So the clinician comes up with the columns here. So these are the types of measures. These are the types of parameters or variables that we want to measure. It could be heart rate, could be resting heart rate, it could be heart rate variability, breathing rate, blood oxygenation, skin temperature, core body temperature, and sleep. And so, and on the other side, on the horizontal, is what the clinician might come up with, right? I'm sorry, the engineer side might come up with. So, what are the types of modalities that are available in typical wearable devices? So ECG, for example, electrocardiography, PPG, photoplethysmography. I'll get into this in a bit more detail in a little bit. Accelerometers and gyroscopes, the types of sensors that Vivek mentioned. Temperature sensor. So we're trying to create this matrix of what are the types of measures that we want, what are the types of sensor modalities that we might have, and then the ticks here represent the intersections between those. So we have this, and that would be a great place to start thinking about what sensors to use. Now, There's a variety of sensors out there, right? Or a variety of options out there in terms of sensors that you might use. Now, of course, we started this whole thing off saying we want wearable devices, so we'll stick to that. But I just wanted to give you the larger perspective on this, right? So, it's not just wearables, right? So, you might say, well, I want to just use smartphones because it has a much broader reach. A lot more people have smartphones and wearables. Maybe I want to use that. Maybe I don't want people to wear anything at all. So there might be remote sensors, and there are a number of these remote sensing using wireless and other signals that have come out in recent years, and they're promising. You might say, well, I want to use a whole bunch of smart home technologies because I want to monitor people throughout the time when they're inside their home, not just when they're wearing a device. Or you might say, I want this fancy new type of sensor that's not quite, maybe not even in the market, and but that has something very interesting in terms of what it can measure. So there's a lot of choices here. And of course, we said wearables, and we'll go with that. But I want to sort of give you a sense of the trade-offs that one has to think about when deciding across this set, right? And that comes back to sort of this question of really I call it the push and pull, right? The technology push versus the the pull from the clinician, right? So you have to think about what is desirable and what's feasible, and get to the sweet spot, right? So you might have a lot of things that you want to measure, but they may not be feasible with the technology you think you want to measure, like a wearable device in this context, in this application, in this particular problem that I'm presenting is a perfect fit, but that may not always be the case, right? And so you really have to sit out and think, this is great, but I may not be able to get that kind of information from a wearable device or from a wrist-worn wearable device. I might have to place it in the knee. I think Vivek pointed out several examples of where an accelerometer might need to be placed in different parts of the body depending on what you're measuring. So that involves this whole clinician-engineer interaction where the clinician says, look, I want to measure this, and I want to measure this using a Fitbit. But the engineer might say, that's not a great idea for so-and-so reasons, and that's a dialogue that needs to happen. So here I've shown a sort of a more slightly deeper dive at this question of trade-offs, right? So let's look at, I'm looking at sleep sensors, sleep trackers, and I'm looking at two axes here: the comfort axis versus the capability axis. And so sleep is obviously one of the measures that we really care about, and a lot of activities happening in the space. On the right lower bottom right corner here is polysomnography, which some of you might have heard about. It's the clinically accurate sleep sensing mechanism, but it involves a whole bunch of these leads that you put in the head and different parts of your body. It involves these bulky devices that's taking all of the signals from 24 different electrodes and whatnot, and then digitizing it and storing it. And so it's a very cumbersome, very intrusive type of way of measuring sleep. But that's what happens in the sleep clinic. Now, that on the other side of the spectrum is saying, well, let's forget about trying to wear anything. We have this device that's placed bedside or somewhere in the home, and it's just measuring whatever you need. Now, of course, you're going to sacrifice something in the process, right? So the remote monitoring device is going to probably only give you some gross sleep measurement, gross posture, and those kinds of things. It's not getting, it's not the same level of information as getting an EEG signal from the brain, right? So that it's not going to get into the finer grained sleep stages or finer grained information about sleep disorders, but it will give you some broad course level thing that might be fine. In the case of the COVID-19 monitoring, that might be fine, right? But these are the trade-offs. And in between are a variety of different devices. A wrist-worn device like a Fitbit or a ring that some of you might have used or seen. These are practical devices, practical alternatives, not significantly more cumbersome than not wearing anything. It's a little bit cumbersome. Maybe the wristwatches are not great for sleep, but the rings are fine. But they don't measure EEG either, right? So they're also not measuring the exact at the source. They're not in the head. So they're measuring proxy signals and then using that. And then you might have things like sleep masks and headbands, which are getting closer to the source, right? They're getting closer to the source of the actual signal you care about, but they're a little bit more cumbersome. So the point is there's a range of things, right? And I've just only touched on comfort versus capability. Similarly, you have to ask the question about what about accuracy? Each of these devices presents different accuracies in terms of how well they can measure what you care about. So there's this complicated trade-off between comfort, accuracy, obtrusiveness. You might care about power consumption. Do I want to charge my sleep mask every day, or do I want this to last a week? Right, there's a lot of questions here. Right, and even if you say, oh, I've decided on wrist-worn wearables, well, what next, right? I mean, there's a whole bunch of different wrist-worn wearables out there in the market, and you might, it's quite puzzling, in fact, if you start looking at all of them and what they advertise, because each of them has slight differences in the sensors that are available there. For example, some of them might have a skin temperature sensor, some of them might not. Some of them might advertise as saying, I will give you heart rate variability, some might not, right? So there's a whole range of, I don't know, dozens of, probably at least a dozen popular wrist-worn devices in the market. And then the next question is, well, how do I choose across these, right? So there's a number of design choices that get into this problem. Okay, 1 second. And so, the next question, so let's say you've narrowed down your choices. And so you've narrowed down your choices in this case to the Apple Watch, the latest Apple Watch, and the Fitbit, the latest Fitbit, okay? And so you go off, you look at what it's providing, the data sheets. You say, well, let me just color in green and tick off the ones that actually they claim to be measuring, and see what it looks like. And so it's quite interesting. The Apple Watch, for example, measures quite a lot, right? Both of these devices measure quite a lot. It's very impressive. Heart rate variability, resting heart rate, respiration rate. The latest Apple Watch also, measures oxygenation, blood, and sleep parameters as well. The Fitbit Sense is a little bit more, maybe one less and one more. It doesn't give you SpO2 measurement, the oxygen saturation measurement, but it does give you the skin temperature, right? So okay, so now you have a trade-off between which one do I use. But I'm going to dive in maybe just to give you a little bit more further. At this stage, you might already think you have what you need, right? You might already think you have the parameters are there. You've already created this matrix. You kind of know what these devices give you. It's time to choose, right? But it's actually valuable to sort of sit down and talk to the engineers and see a little bit more, a little bit deeper level what's going on underneath the covers here, because it'll give you a new perspective, a different perspective on how to approach these problems. So let me start that process. And this is just to open up. Let's open up the Fitbit, for example, the Fitbit Sense, and see what happens here. And so I just I show you this just because these are impressive feats of engineering, right? I mean, it's just remarkable how much is packed into that tiny little package, and it's just ridiculous when we think about what has advanced over the last couple of decades, but even the last 5-10 years, right? So what you see outside is, of course, you see these light shining LEDs, what they're called LEDs, that shine the green light or the various colors of light, and sometimes they don't shine a light; they're infrared, and so. And there are the photodiodes. Those are the things you see in the bottom of the Fitbit or one of these sensors. And then there's things covering them. There's a whole range of other sensors that we talked about, or they said they have. So where are those located? Well, they're cleverly located all over the place. Some of those electrodes, metal electrodes are in the casing. And they're present, they're just in the casing. They're pressure sensors. The electrodes can be used for ECG, but also for electrodermal activity, which is another interesting metric. And then there's accelerometers and gyroscopes and so on stuck on the board itself. So it's a very impressive beast. And of course, there's the processing capability, the radios, all of that. Okay, and these things last for, 7 days. I mean, it's just impressive. So let's look at the sensors. I'll just look at two for now. I mean, I think Vivek talked about the accelerometer a whole lot, so I'll skip that for now. But let's look at the PPG sensor, the photoplethysmography sensor. It's a long name, but essentially all it does is there's an LED or a few LEDs. They're shining light. Right? They're shining light down into the wrist. And so as the blood flows, the blood absorbs the light. Right? The blood absorbs everything else except red. And so depending on the amount of blood flow, the absorption changes. And so you have these very sensitive detectors called photodiodes. And those photodiodes are essentially seeing the color changes, right? How much is reflected. They're seeing the changes in what's being reflected. And that's how they're measuring blood flow. And that's what was referred to as photoplethysmography. Like photo is like the light part of it, optical part, right? So that's the underlying mechanism here. And so then what happens is the photoplethysmography information goes through a whole range of signal processing pipeline to extract information from it. You get these low-level markers, kind of these low-level measures, as Vivek was saying, the beat-to-beat interval, what's called the RR interval between the peaks of your heartbeat, as well as various other things. In fact, people speculate that there's many more metrics you can extract from these kinds of like something like PPG than what's available on many devices today. And so that shows you that there's, we are somewhere in, we've come a long way, but there's still a long way to go. There's many more types of metrics that one can extract. Like VO2 max is not something that we extract. So you get all of these measures from the PPG processing, and then you get these higher level information that's what's exposed to you using whatever interface is there, right? So what is the resting heart rate? What is the heart rate variability? What is the, there's things like cardiac efficiency and blood. What is the blood oxygenation, which is coming from your, the Apple Watch. So all of those are higher level metrics that are extracted from these low level information. Right, now, the thing to remember, and the reason I went into the segue is because there is inaccuracy in wearable monitors. And this is often the most frustrating part and probably the most difficult to understand part of what, when you look at this problem. And the inaccuracy a lot of times is, it's not as well characterized as you might imagine. Right. So for example, this was a study from 2020. So this was a study you might have heard, when the Apple Watches initially came out with their heart rate sensors and so on, there was a lot of talk about, well, these things don't work on certain skin tones. They work on the light skin people. They don't work really great on the darker skin tones. They don't work when people are moving. Some of this, of course, looks bad, right? You might look like, well, these guys are just optimizing it for the lighter skin tone. But in this particular case, there's certainly a deeper underlying technical problem at play here. So this study looked at what's going on. This study looked at a whole bunch of consumer wearables and research grade wearables and looked at what do the errors look like. And so just to show you, to illustrate, so the color coding here is the skin tones. And so on the left A here is at rest. What is the error at rest? So you can see that it is true that the error at rest, it does perform pretty well on the lighter skin tones, and that's for no particular reason than the reflection is much easier to see with that skin tone. Otherwise there's much more absorption going on from the skin, and so less is reflected. It's much harder to see what's reflected from the blood as opposed to the skin when it comes to the darker skin tone. So that's the problem there. But you can see that there's some truth to that. But when you have physical activity, there's so much motion artifact that's no longer the trouble. It's just motion artifacts cause like up to 10% error, or even more in the worst case, but up to 10% average error in the heart rate reading that you get. 10% is a lot, but but that's something to remember, right? There's error in the wearable monitors. But when it comes to something like heart rate variability, the errors can be much worse, right? So the heart rate variability can be 100% error in certain cases, right? So this is a whole bunch of different heart rate variability based metrics that are commonly used, and the errors can range. Some metrics is pretty tight, some metrics is like pretty wide, right? And the minimum, for example, is super wide, 200% error, right? So the heart rate variability errors can be all over the place, right? And why is this the case? And there's a lot of reasons for this, but one is because we shoehorn everything to the wrist, and this is often, often the technology. I often find this challenge, which is the engineer side comes and says, well, we're trying to extract metrics that are not so great from the wrist, right? Don't we have better places to put this sensor? Can't we put it in the head? Can't we put it in the ear, for example? There are much better places where you get a much cleaner signal. But of course, the users, the practicality of it is that nobody's going to wear a device which requires you to put it on other parts of the body, especially today with the cultural norms and the social norms, right? So, and so in fact, some of the best monitors that were available 10 years back were armbands, not wristbands. But they phased out and they went away largely because They were just not as attractive as placing something on the wrist. So we live with these downsides, but that is one of the reasons. There's another reason, which is that the PPG signal itself, the photoplethysmography signal, is not quite as clear cut as the ECG signal that you get from, like a clinical grade device. And so, for example, this is the ECG signal, sharp peaks, very sharp looking, right? And so this is more the PPG signal, much more rounded in nature. And it flattens out, in fact, if the signal is weaker. And so from this kind of signal, when it flattens out, it's very hard to pick out what is the exact location of your peak, right? You might say, oh, I want heart rate variability, so I need to pick out these peaks. But you might not. You might have a large amount of error in picking up these peaks from a PPG signal. In addition to that, you can see the PPG sort of varies a lot based on, amplitude variations are high, motion artifacts are higher. So we're working with fundamentally a slightly worse signal than ECG, right? So that's part of the challenge too, right? That's why, some of the metrics are also not very stable. So let's go back to our matrix that we had, right? So the matrix looked all great, but we actually need to color code it if we want to be more precise about what it's able to monitor, right? So here I've color coded it as, green is great, more red is worse, right? So some metrics are great, like your respiration rate, your resting heart rate, perfect. You're getting excellent metrics. Some are not so great, right? So you're getting heart rate, rhythm, and so on, fine. Even with physical activity, 5% error, maybe you're fine with that. Heart rate variability, not so great. Oxygen saturation, not great at all, right? So the gradation of things, sleep, kind of in between. You're getting crude measures, perhaps, certainly not a very good measure of REM sleep or deep sleep or any of these sleep stages, but at a rough level, you're getting some rough approximation of sleep. So this is even this, frankly, is perhaps a little high level, right? So reality is you have to understand a little bit more. Is this the skin tone that's causing this? Is this the activity that's causing this? Is this some other character? Is this this person has a pre-existing condition? Maybe they're obese, or maybe they have diabetes. And the moment you have one of these conditions, that also changes the signal of your PPG sensor, because now your blood flow is lower, your reflection is lower, you're getting more noise, you're getting a weaker signal. So that changes the entire picture here. So all of these require a much more in-depth understanding. And perhaps the most frustrating part is that you will not get this kind of understanding if you just go off and pull up what Apple or Fitbit says, right? They are not, partly because I don't know that they themselves have done the level of study it takes to understand all of it. It's a complicated problem, right? And so they're going to tell you, they're going to tell you the sensors that are there and the metrics that it can expose, but not the deeper details of what is the accuracy and what is the accuracy of these individuals have this pre-existing condition. That's not available. And in fact, what's harder is, remember the study I showed you from 2020 that used, this is 2021, right? We were just 1 year off, but 2 generations of wristwatches have already, we're down, we moved 2 generations of wristwatches from when that study was done, even though it's hardly a year and a half old or so, right? So they might have started the study in 2019. The paper was published in 2020. By now, we are 2 generations later. Sensors have changed. Everything has changed, right? The number of, so you don't know where to start next, right? So these are hard problems, and I'm not saying there's a clear solution, but this is the thought, and we have to sort of, there's some thinking that one has to do, pragmatic thinking about what is the fundamentals of what these sensors can achieve, what can we assume about what the errors are, and so on, that get, that need to be thought through when you start using these modalities. All right, so that's step 1. Okay, and then you run your clinical trial. Many of you are experts in this, and then I think Vivek went into this a great deal, so I will skip this part. So you run your clinical trial, and so after the clinical trial comes the analysis part, right? So you have your data, and the assumption, and it's important to know that you have to, many times with the deep learning era and artificial intelligence hype and everything else upon us, it's very easy to assume that if I get a lot of data, I will get a lot of useful information. That is absolutely wrong when it comes to these kinds of devices, right? So it is really important to know that with these kinds of devices, you cannot offset easily. No amount of machine learning and artificial, data analysis will offset just imprecise or bad data, right? There's not much you can do if there's no signal, right? So you really, really have to pay attention to the first part to make sure the signal that you're getting is good enough. And then I think and then you can do a lot more interesting things, but the signal has to be in the ballpark of being reasonable at the very least, right? So let's talk about the signal analysis pipeline. You have the data, then what do we do now? So as Vivek was mentioning, I think the first step usually is everything operates in windows of information, and the reason is partly because everything, we are talking about temporally changing phenomena, right? Anything you're detecting is over a time window, and different things might operate over different time windows. So you always are talking you're not taking 10 weeks of data and then saying, I'll just take the whole thing and shove it into some machine learning technique. That's not how it works. You're really chopping up the data into smaller segments, and you have to think through, depending the problem, what is the segment. For example, if I'm doing activity recognition, like am I sitting, standing, walking, that's a very short window, right? Your activities can change in the order of minutes. So you might only take a minute's worth of data and you want to detect what activity I'm performing in that window. But if I'm doing something like the COVID-19 symptom tracking, that's not going to change over the span of minutes. So my window might be hours, right? So you have to think through what is the window size that I'm operating over and that I want to make my decisions over. And as I said, the windows might be different. So certain symptoms might change over shorter time scales. Certain symptoms might, like if you're measuring some heart rate variability type of things, you might want to track it at some reasonable time scale that is like an hour or half an hour or even shorter. But when it comes to certain symptoms, sleep-related patterns, that might only change over the span of many days or a week, right? So you might have multi-scale. There are many types of, these are modeling techniques that I think will be introduced in one of the later lectures, but there are many different time scales at which you extract features and you operate on those features. The model needs to be able to leverage features at different time scales as well. And so the next step is removing noise. Now, no matter how good your sensor is, you're always going to have noise. A lot of the noise tends to be what's called motion artifacts, but there's other sources of noise as well. So you have measured a signal, and then you really want to get the clean signal and remove the noise. And there's a number of standard techniques that people use, and it's a big field. The engineers you work with should have a good handle on the space. But there's a big space of time domain method, like averaging. I mean, the signal I showed on the top here had all these glitchy spikes, and a lot of these can be just removed by median filtering or some simple time domain averaging technique. But sometimes you want what's referred to as frequency domain techniques. For example, like ECG has built-in. So with ECG, for example, the most common source of noise is power line noise. Like your power line goes at 50 hertz. Power line goes through all the power lines at home, and that 50 hertz noise just isn't right in the sweet spot of what you're measuring with ECG. But it's a very specialized signal, right? 50 hertz, you know exactly that's the only source of my noise is exactly 50 hertz. So there are these frequency domain filters that you can use to just remove that. You might remove low frequency noise due to motion artifacts. You might remove high frequency noise due to electronics. But there are good methods to this. And then there are wavelet-based methods that are in between time and frequency. There are adaptive noise removal methods. The noise might change over time. And you have to sort of track it and remove it. And there's a whole number of parameters that you have to sort of think through. And you, as in the team, is to think through, right? So what is the signal to noise ratio I want? What is the correlations across the different signals? The reference and the filter signals? What are the different cutoff frequencies? What are the order of the filter? You can go wrong in a lot of these and create artifacts that will then look like its features. It's very, it's very common, not at all uncommon, that people do these kinds of filtering mechanisms, but they, inadvertently introduce artifacts into the signal. And those artifacts, now later on, the signal processing or the machine learning pipeline thinks of those artifacts as actually signals, and then sort of it might pick up on those and might use those, and that's obviously not what you care about. So you have to be careful for all of these parameters in the noise removal pipeline. And there's a lot of different types of noise removal, and I'll just mention one just because it's interesting. A lot of these noise removal is not just by averaging and so on. Like PPG, we've talked about PPG. PPG, you might use the accelerometer, because oftentimes motion artifacts are the main source of noise, but the accelerometer gives you motion. right? So the accelerometer can be sort of a measure of the motion artifacts, and you can kind of compensate and cancel out some of the motion artifacts using accelerometer information together with PPG. Sometimes it's sort of multiple LEDs. There are some clever ways in which you can use green plus red or green plus infrared LEDs and cancel out some of the noise with those as well. So there's a lot of different ways people go after the noise problem. All right, so the next phase, you remove noise, and so the next phase of the pipeline is feature extraction, which, you know, and so what that means here is your goal is basically, you know, you want to give the machine learning pipeline, you know, you have a lot of domain knowledge, as I mentioned earlier. In this particular problem, we have a ton of domain knowledge about what kind of signals are relevant, what sort of things do you know, we've seen, the clinicians have seen a lot of patients, and so they have some sense about the types of features that they would look for, right, in a patient. Like, what are the types of signals they would look for? And so this can be encoded into features that you feed into the machine learning or the classification pipeline. And that's often a very good place to start, because it's important not to sort of, you know, even though in the deep learning space, it's easy to say, let's just throw the data at some algorithm and it'll figure it out. You're much better off, for reasons I'll mention shortly, you're much better off trying to actually you know, take the domain knowledge and try to feed them as explicit features, because that'll bootstrap, it'll require less data, less chances of giving you some arbitrary, you know, of the algorithm picking up some arbitrary feature. So you're better off trying to encode the domain knowledge into features. And there's a variety of different methods, you know, types of features, time domain, like means and medians and variations, standard deviations, so on. What's called frequency domain features. What are the dominant frequencies in your signal? For example, if you're running, the dominant frequency is going to be different, higher frequency than if you're walking, right? So dominant frequency is sometimes useful as well. 10 minutes, great. There's a lot of different types of features you can extract. And there's another category which might be interesting. And I just say this because, you know, you may not have tried to play around or work with these types of features, but it's important to know that there's time, frequency, and similarity. And similarity means that you might say that, look, I want to look for trends that are similar to the COVID patients that I have in my data set, right? So I want to look for symptom trends or trends in heart rate variability or sleep or what have you, but I want these trends to match the trends of the patients that I've seen who've tested positive, right? So there are some types of similarity, there are these types of similarity features that are also quite useful, you know, in these kinds of problems, okay? But so let me take one example. I take one example of a particular type of you know, one of the variables that we talked about, and I'll go through what features we might extract there. So let's take a look at heart rate variability. Now, I picked out heart rate variability because I find that a lot of people, there's a significant amount of interest in heart rate variability, much more so than heart rate itself. And, you know, there's things like stress, and many things have been linked to heart rate variability. And so there's often a lot of medical literature going back 20, 30 years on heart rate variability and its effect on a lot of different aspects of behavior and health. And so there's a lot of interest in this context. What heart rate variability just means is, you know, when you think about heart rate, it's just the average, right? What's the average number of times my heart beats? But it's actually modulated heartbeats, right? Because of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. It's a modulated heartbeat. And so heart rate variability looks deeper at how these RR intervals, these interbeat intervals are changing and the patterns of those. And there's some very fascinating information that can be held there. But just to give you a flavor, I'm not going to get into the details here. An example of a time domain feature is the standard deviation, the root mean square standard deviation of these RR intervals. Look at the intervals and look at the root mean square standard deviation of that. That's a very classic you know, metric that's used for a time domain metric that's used for heart rate variability. The frequency domain metric, you know, again, there's been a lot of study on trying to take the, you know, the heartbeat rhythms depend on various types of activities in the body. You know, there's the stress, you know, the fight or flight type of activity, but there's also the digestion and the slow changes that also has these rhythmic patterns. And so people sort of extract various bands of frequencies from this using a Fourier transform. They take the time domain, they convert it into frequency, you extract various bands, and there's a lot of literature on low frequencies, very low frequencies, high frequencies, all sorts of divisions and what it might mean in terms of trying to explain what's happening there. But these are the types of features. And so heart rate variability features might look like these. Just a laundry list, just to give you a flavor of what's going on, what kind of features people extract. Time domain features are these, and frequency domain features, like different bands, different frequencies, and different bands. And one of the reasons I mentioned this is also this is also something that actually these features and what features you're interested in is also something that you have to take into account before deciding what devices you might use. It's typically, typically clinical grade devices, like there are devices like the Empatica and other clinical grade wearable devices, wrist phone wearables. They're much more expensive, and studies have shown that they're not quite as precise in terms of the markers, like the heart rate estimation may not be quite as good across a population level as your Fitbit or your Apple Watch. So they do worse in some ways when it comes to some of these measures of interest, but they're still used by clinicians. In fact, clinical studies oftentimes prefer to use those kinds of devices, even though they're more expensive than the Fitbits. And part of the reason for that is that if you care about one of these metrics, your commercial devices are rarely going to give you raw data, right? They're rarely going to give you raw information, even though they have this scale. And so the benefits of using commercial devices, obviously, is that they're just incredibly well engineered and manufactured. They last a long time. People love to use them. They're pretty and all of that jazz, right? So they're great, but they're not going to give you the data, the low level raw data from which you might extract features. So if you've done any study that says, oh, look, very low frequency power is great, that's not something you might be able to extract from information from a Fitbit. So that's also something that comes into play when you think about which devices to use. So moving on, let me end with the classification side, and you'll hear more about classification and the various algorithms and so on in the later lectures. But I'll give you a glimpse of the trade-offs, just because I want to go through the whole thing so that you have a holistic sense of what's going on here. And so, again, you have your sensors, you extract your features, and there's a number of different machine learning models you might have heard about: support vector machines, random forests, k-nearest neighbor, decision trees, neural networks, of course, hidden Markov models. So that's the place, right? So you take these features and you try to understand which models are best, which is the ideal one for the problem that you're after, which is COVID-19 symptom prediction. But of course, I should, one has to also look at the deep learning space, right? So, and I think it's important to at least understand the difference between, deep learning is just a rage, right? It's just taken over the world of AI, the world of computer science and our everyday thinking by storm, right? And so we have to think through that aspect here too. But it's sort of important to understand the pros and cons. So one thing that I will, the deep learning models are incredibly powerful, and so so you don't even need necessarily to provide it features. It can learn features from data. So that's great, right? You don't really need to hand code or hard code features. What if your features that you're thinking are wrong, right? Deep learning can learn features, but at the same time, it comes with some caveats. And the primary caveat is that you need a lot of labeled data, right? And you may not have a ton of labeled data when it comes to these kinds of deep learning models, right? So those are the types of trade-offs when you think about using classical machine learning models versus deep learning, and those are things that I think you'll hear about in later lectures as well. But there's a lot of different aspects here. You have to think about the size of your labeled data. Oftentimes with mHealth studies, you don't have a ton of labeled data, so you're better off using smaller models. But that depends, right? There's no one solution. Prior knowledge, right? What features do you know? What features are going to be good predictors that you have to encode into your model? How interpretable do you want it to be? Do you want to make a decision based on this? If so, you better have some sense of why the model is telling you that this, are you fine with the fact that the model just says this person is likely to have symptoms of COVID-19. So you can do a screening after that. That's perfectly fine. There's a black box, but maybe you want to know more, right? The interpretability is something that might be important. Also, other factors, computational efficiency, other things might come into play here. All right. So to conclude here, I think I hope I've convinced you that it's really important to get a holistic understanding. There are many interrelated factors when you make decisions. It's not easy to think, I just want a wearable device on my wrist, and I want to use the Apple Watch, because that comes with its own caveats. It's useful to know that, right? Even though you might eventually go with that device, you have to know what you're getting into. What are the caveats? What are the pitfalls? What are the positives? And that will help you in reducing problems and so on. And remember that not all technology is the same. There's so many different trade-offs between technology. And oftentimes the clinician, there's always this divide. Should I use some new technology that may not be popular or widely available, but that gives me good data? Or should I use a technology that's widely available, but that may not give me the best data? Right? There's no good answer to this, but these are things you have to think about. And then finally, I think if I have to emphasize one thing here, data quality is extremely, extremely important. And it is so easy to think that just collecting a lot of data is the answer to solving the problem, but that is not the case. Garbage in, garbage out, right? No matter how, if a ton of bad data is not going to do anything to you. I mean, there's only so far you can exploit the correlations between modalities and all of that stuff. There's only so far that will go. You need good data from each sensor, particularly good data on the modalities and the variables that you care about. Okay, so those are all. I'll end there, and I think I'm exactly on time. So thank you, and Vivek.
Great, thank you, Deepak, for a terrific summary. At this point, I'll will open it up to the scholars, and you have your experiences. This is a good safe space for you to ask your questions and trade experiences. Let me begin, Deepak, by asking you, how does a end user go about connecting with someone like you at the institution or across institutions? What is the best way to approach, say, let's say you? If I am interested in engaging you in a study, I have a clinical problem to solve.
That's a great point. That's a great question. And of course, there are in some cases there are these. I would say one answer to this is that many universities these days have an interdisciplinary institute. I mean, this space, it's very clear that you need engagement across different disciplines to make big breakthroughs, right? In this, and so I think many institutions have these interdisciplinary institutes that are coming up. They're good. For example, we have one at UMASS called the Institute of Applied Life Sciences. I lead one of the centers there, and we have people from kinesiology and nursing, and there's a lot of crosstalk and a lot of opportunity. But that's within that cocoon, right? They're within each university. Now, but I will say one thing I will say is that engineers are very interested. I mean, it's I think if one gets over that initial barrier to just cold calling somebody, you will get a good response normally. In other words, there's plenty of interest on the clinical side. I mean, I've seen both sides, right? When I've approached clinical folks, even very senior folks, people with very little time on their hands, and this is true from the other side as well. A lot of times it's only time that's limiting, not interest in the problem. But you approach people, it's an exciting, people are excited about these problems. I think the one thing to remember though is that I think you've said this previously also, the engineers will think about, is this advancing the science of the technology? That gets them wowed and that gets them going. So that middle ground is something that's always hard to navigate. If it's like, should I use a Fitbit for this or should I use an Apple Watch? That's harder to engage a computer science professor, for example, right? Because that becomes less of something that they do in their day-to-day. That's less of their question. So it's an interesting question. I've touched on a lot of things, but hopefully I've kind of given you an answer.
Perfect. Let me open it up to these scholars who have used or plan to use sensors.
Deepak, I have a question. I'm at UCSD. That was a great talk. One thing that I struggle with, I'm a clinician with interest in technology, obviously, but I can't really gauge with all the deep learning and all the other options that are out there. How does one gauge, when you're not an engineer yourself, if the right model is being chosen, or if you're kind of on the path to the wrong direction? Because there's so many different ways to do machine learning, and I just don't have the expertise to know if we're spending 3 months on the wrong modeling, or, you know, with all the different details that you provided for where it can go wrong. Do you have any guidance on, you know, how to vet that, and how to, you know, just sort of get on the right train?
That's a good question. So, yeah, I mean, I think to a first approximation, it's useful to, you know, even as a clinician, to know what the pitfalls are. I think that's one thing that often to at least, because you have to, even if you're going, I think oftentimes I've seen clinicians will hire a computer science master's student or a graduate student to do some of their work maybe, and to do some of their data analysis. But it's important to be able to ask the right questions of them, right? To make, you know, to make sure that they, even though, because sometimes it's like they present something, they present some data, they present some results, it looks good, but is it actually real, or have they forgotten some aspect of it? So one side of this is, yes, I think there's a lot of, if you know UCSD for sure, there's plenty of master's students and you know, computer science master's students who get very advanced training, right? I mean, they get training into sort of cutting edge methods in this space. So finding people with some experience of data analysis and with that kind of course training will get you through part of the way, right? Part of the way. But it's still important to ask the right questions of these students to make sure that they're actually thinking through the various problems, because with small amounts of data, oftentimes many things can go wrong. If you just drop a model at it, there's all kinds of problems that can occur. So yeah, I mean, this is a good question, and I think we will only resolve this through more interdisciplinary training. But certainly I would encourage reaching out to, you know, I think computer science students or engineering students are often on the lookout, and they love the interdisciplinary problem. So that's one place to start.
Let me add to that, Venkatesh. So I would say stay away from students. Let me tell you why. Students have information to knowledge, you know, access to information. They don't have the wisdom that comes. They don't have the high level thinking you actually need for the kind of studies you do. You say you're at a place like UCSD, which is a powerhouse in computer science, and people like Rajesh Gupta and all are there. Reach out. You will find, see that what Deepak said, engineering is a very solution-rich environment, and health sciences is a very problem-rich environment. And part of this webinar is to make you sophisticated as end users. And so you go in and frame your question in a manner that is scientifically exciting for your engineering collaborator. Because if they can figure out ways of doing edge science on your project, you will attract high-level thinkers. Students are learning. They, you know, an engineering graduate knows the core principles, but they don't have the contextual knowledge to apply to solve the condition. And so I would say, if you're doing these studies, go and engage the best thinkers, edge thinkers, and they don't have to be at UCSD. You may have connections. It may be someone like Deepak at UMASS. Much of my own research is distributed with people at MIT and Michigan. Though I'm at a good university, geography is no longer destiny. So my advice to all of you is go and seek the best.
I agree. And even if you have, I agree. I mean, I think students was just, the assumption was that there will be a mentor. I think you still need a mentor, somebody on the other side. And you can always ask, look, you know, in some cases, so as I said, not all solution problems are things that might excite. That's one of the challenges. Sometimes the problems don't necessarily are not necessarily things that the engineers might be working on in their research capacity, but they still might be willing to mentor students or have their own, you know, have people, their postdocs or somebody take a look at those problems, give you the right sort of advice, and they might be, you know, they might be good people to go back to once in a while. You know, even if you have students doing some of the work.
Other scholars? Oleg, you work a lot with sensors. What have you been your experiences? Any questions?
Well, I think you addressed part of my question. Like my main, high on the priority list was like when you reach out to people in an interdisciplinary field in engineering, it's like how to make it exciting enough for them, but not to steer it into the solution-driven problem, and still keep it like clinically relevant. So I feel that it's still push and pull, and how to find that middle ground that is stimulating enough, but not turn into the kind of solution-driven. So that's my main insight, and I'm still working in that space with the engineering computer science, and going back to the patient populations, trying to figure out like what would be still usable for them.
That's a good point. Actually, on the last day, we will have a talk by Santosh Kumar and Donna on how to talk to an engineer and how to talk to a clinician, and from different perspectives. So we've thought about that. That's a recurrent theme but this much I must say, I deeply admire and appreciate those of you who are willing to get out of your disciplines and stand in that interface between disciplines and say, I don't know, help me here. It takes a lot of courage. So when I look at you, I look at people who are fearless, they want to solve problems, they're not willing, and they're willing to say, I don't know, help me here. I may be very sophisticated in my core deep dive, but in this new space, I want to learn from you, and here are my experiences. And that's a very good place to be, and that's why you are the chosen few. So Helen has, are the key journals or website or experts? We do have something called the mHealth Hub. We are working on that eventually. For now, you can use your resource page where we'll be uploading pages and or relevant papers, and you can download from there. We are trying to work on that kind of core thing through the mHealth Hub hosted by the MD2K Center. The challenge is all of us have finite bandwidth, and even these common good activities, we have to make sure it doesn't consume our working days. There are only so many hours in a day. Any other questions? All right.
So maybe, can I ask one more? So one thing that we're faced with is trying to either partner with industry partners who have products versus using homegrown products from the campus. Do you have any thoughts about choosing one? I mean, obviously you're going to go through the same process that you have nicely detailed, but any thoughts on that?
You want me to take that?
Yeah, either one of you, yeah.
It depends on what you're looking for. For example, both Deepak and I talked about, the vendors, they have proprietary algorithms and they will not open up their systems to you. There is a excitement in having, ready-made Fitbits available to you. They've taken care of the design issues and the manufacturing and all. But if your study is very specific and needs access to raw data, you may want your sensor guide to make you a batch of 50, which can be challenging, but that may be what you're looking for. If you're looking for a scale up of 300, 400 patients, then you're better off going with Fitbit, knowing very well that you will not have access to the raw data. Deepak?
Yeah, I agree. I think just very quickly, what domain would you be thinking of when you say commercial versus in-house?
Well, so I mean, the various sensors, like there's some wearables, there's some bed scales things that are being developed on campus, but then there's also an industry partner who wants to promote, I don't know, one part of their business, they're trying to validate some of their products. So that it's the same space, it's the same sort of wearable space.
Yeah, I think this is a good question, and there's no easy answer. But as I said, I think it's important to know what metrics you might want. So for example, if it's like bed, there are bed sensors, but if they give you a, if you want, I don't know, sleep related or sleep, if you want some finer grain metrics, then of course you're not going to get some of those from a commercial product, but you might get, but it's a trade-off. It's very hard to know unless you really, and if the other thing is many problems, in many cases you might not know ahead of time what exactly is the feature of interest. So that makes it complicated. If you can do a shorter pilot, maybe just to try out like these two sensors, just to understand with a small validation pilot, those are calibration / validation pilot with a ground truth, then that might be helpful just to get a gut sense, because you cannot neither believe, you can neither believe you might be able to believe the accuracy of the thing that you get in-house, but maybe not the comfort and how people feel about it. You might be able to get something comfortable, but not necessarily an accurate one from something, industry. So which one do you go for? So I think it's useful to have some initial experience. You get both of those, you try it out, you get some gut sense of which one is better. That's, if you can validate with some ground truth assessment, then that's even better. But some initial exploration of these options will probably help you.
Great, thank you both.
Deepak, we have a question that relates to, are there any sensors you would recommend for measuring various aspects of breathing or emotions?
Various aspects of breathing. When you say various aspects, you're looking at the deeper breathing and you're looking at probably at the features within breathing, right? Like the exhalation time and the inhalation time and the So that's unfortunately I think the Fitbits are not going to give you that type of fine-grained information. I mean, certainly, there are these MD2K bands or the MD2K chest bands and equivalents from the industry that people have been using for a while. The Zephyr harness, Zephyr bands, and MD2K also has their bands. These are probably the most commonly used devices for breathing, for getting the finer grained features of breathing. You are not going to get exhalation. Durations are maybe from raw data from a wrist to an approximation. You can get duration, like what is the duration between intervals, but the depth and so on, you're not going to get, because this just requires you thoracic activity. You need something on the chest. So for breathing, that's the one. For emotions, emotion is already a construct that is, that's comprised of so many other things underneath that's a much harder one to unpack. And so, normally I would say Spire. Somebody said Spire. Yeah.
That's for respiration. But I think the most maybe interested in stress and stress reactivity. Is there anything that you can pick up from wrist phone wearables for that?
For stress?
Yeah, stress and stress reactivity is,
Yeah, I think I think people who are looking at the space are largely looking at heart rate variability. I think that's the metric that people are looking into in that context. I've heard that the Whoops band and so on is I mean, they market it certainly and for athletes as being very measuring heart rate variability. For patients, I'm not so sure. But the commodity devices are getting better at this heart rate variability. But I would say heart rate variability based devices are the ones to look at that context.
Okay, great. I think we need to wrap it up. I thank you all for being here today.